The Berlin Reichstag stands today, crowned with a glass dome that architecture students are taught was added in the 1990s by Norman Foster. But the original Reichstag was completed in 1894, with its own dome, a massive stone and iron structure that burned in 1933 and was later demolished. What nobody asks is why a building designed in the 1880s needed such an elaborate dome in the first place, or why its restoration required essentially the same architectural element centuries later, as if the design itself was non-negotiable. The official story presents this as aesthetic choice and democratic symbolism. The architectural record suggests something else entirely: a structural necessity that transcends style, a technological requirement that both the original designers and modern architects understood but could never publicly acknowledge. Walk through the Reichstag on a winter morning when the light cuts through Foster's glass spiral, and you'll notice something immediately. The dome isn't decorative. It's a massive ventilation and light distribution system, a technological apparatus disguised as architecture. The original 1894 dome performed the same function using different materials. A steel framework supporting glass panels designed by Paul Wallet to channel air and sunlight into the parliamentary chamber below. The building required this. Not wanted it, required it. The plenary hall sits at the heart of a structure that otherwise would suffocate its occupants. A massive stone enclosure with limited windows and thousands of cubic meters of enclosed space. Without the dome's natural ventilation system, the Reichstag would have been uninhabitable during sessions, a tomb rather than a parliament. Yet Wallet's plans show something peculiar. The dome's engineering specifications exceed what 19th century ventilation technology should require. The air channels, the light wells, the structural reinforcements supporting the cupola all suggest the building was designed to accommodate forces and flows that standard parliamentary architecture simply doesn't generate. The site itself carries older significance. Before the Reichstag, this location housed the Raksinski Palace, acquired and demolished specifically for the Parliament building. Before that, the area was part of the Tiergarten's edge, undeveloped land that Berlin's planners left empty for centuries despite the city's expansion. When Kaiser Wilhelm I laid the cornerstone in 1884, the ceremony included rituals that official histories describe as standard Masonic practice. The placement of contemporary documents, coins, and newspapers in a sealed chamber beneath the foundation. But witness accounts from journalists present that day mention something else: a metallic container lowered into the foundation shaft before the cornerstone ceremony. Something that required 6 men to position, and that reflected sunlight in a way contemporary metals simply didn't. The container was sealed into the structure before any official documentation began. Whatever was placed beneath the Reichstag that day, it wasn't in the time capsule that historians later cataloged. Consider the architectural competition that selected Wallet's design. 189 architects submitted proposals, and the winning design was the only one that featured a central dome of such ambitious proportions. The Kaiser initially rejected it as too grandiose, too expensive, too technically challenging. Yet construction proceeded with that exact design. The dome not reduced or simplified, but built precisely as proposed, despite budget overruns and engineering difficulties that pushed completion nearly a decade beyond schedule. The dome's construction required innovations in iron framework engineering that wouldn't become standard until the 20th century. Curved tension members, load distribution systems, glass panels mounted in ways that allowed thermal expansion without framework stress. The building's engineers were solving problems that theoretically shouldn't have existed yet, developing solutions to challenges that contemporary architecture didn't face. Unless the building had requirements that contemporary architecture wasn't designed to meet. The interior layout reveals more. The plenary hall sits directly beneath the dome's apex, positioned with mathematical precision so that the dome's central oculus aligns with the speaker's podium. The alignment isn't symbolic, it's geometric. Light entering through the dome's apex during specific times of year creates patterns on the chamber floor that architectural historians attribute to Wallet's interest in natural illumination. But the patterns are too precise, too consistent with astronomical alignments that have nothing to do with parliamentary function. On the spring and autumn equinoxes, sunlight entering through the dome traces a line from the podium to the northern entrance, a solar alignment that requires the building's orientation, the dome's height, and the oculus diameter to be calculated within centimeters of accuracy. 19th-century architects understood solar alignment, but they didn't typically engineer parliamentary buildings like solar temples. Unless the building was serving functions beyond parliamentary debate, the Reichstag's substructure extends far deeper than structural necessity requires. Official plans show foundations reaching 11 meters below ground level, anchored in bedrock with a complexity that engineers at the time found excessive for a building of this type on this terrain. Berlin's geology doesn't require such deep foundations. Surrounding buildings from the same era use conventional footings at half that depth. Yet the Reichstag's foundation chambers are more extensive, containing spaces that architectural surveys identify as storage and mechanical areas. But that show design features inconsistent with that explanation. Vaulted ceilings, reinforced walls, ventilation shafts that connect to the surface through paths that don't align with the building's visible structure. The foundation layout suggests the building extends downward in ways that surface architecture doesn't reflect, as if the visible parliament were merely the upper portion of a much larger complex. The original dome's destruction tells its own story. The Reichstag fire of February 1933 began in the plenary hall, but spread with unusual speed to the dome structure itself. Firefighters reported that the dome's iron framework heated and deformed in ways that iron shouldn't behave in typical building fires, glowing with colors that suggested temperatures far exceeding what burning wood and fabric produce. The dome's collapse came suddenly, the entire structure failing simultaneously rather than section by section as controlled demolition engineers would expect. Photographs from the aftermath show the dome's iron framework twisted into configurations that metallurgists examining the images decades later found inconsistent with fire damage alone. The metal appears to have been subjected to forces that pulled and compressed it in multiple directions simultaneously. Deformation patterns that look less like fire damage and more like explosive directional stress. What began as political arson may have destroyed something that was meant to be destroyed. The building's reconstruction after World War II is equally revealing. Soviet forces used the Reichstag as a strategic position during the Battle of Berlin in 1945, famously raising their flag from its ruins. But before that symbolic moment, Soviet engineers spent 3 days surveying the building's interior, documenting damage and mapping structural elements with thoroughness that seemed excessive for a military operation. Red Army records show that specialized teams examined the foundation levels, removed specific elements from the substructure, and transported sealed containers back to Moscow before the building was handed over to Allied administration. What they removed was never cataloged in official records. The building stood as a damaged shell throughout the Cold War, its dome completely removed by 1954. The structure maintained but never fully restored until German reunification. For 40 years, the building existed without its defining architectural element, as if removing the dome had neutralized whatever function it served. If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. Norman Foster's commission to rebuild the Reichstag came with specific parameters that weren't purely architectural. The German parliament stipulated that the restoration must include a dome, not as historical reference, but as functional requirement. Foster's initial designs featured a flat glass roof, modern and minimalist, all rejected. The dome was mandatory, and it had to be positioned precisely where Wallet's original dome stood, aligned with the same geometric specifications. Foster's final design creates a dome that's architecturally distinct from the original, but functionally identical. A large-scale ventilation and light distribution system centered over the plenary hall, using updated materials to achieve the same air circulation patterns that Wallet's dome provided. The spiral walkway that tourists now climb through the dome serves an engineering purpose before it serves a symbolic one. It creates a convection channel that draws hot air up from the chamber below while pulling fresh air in from perimeter vents. A natural climate control system that operates without mechanical assistance. The building breathes through its dome, exactly as it did in 1894. The dome's glass construction reveals engineering sophistication that goes beyond sustainable architecture. The glass panels are arranged in a double-skin configuration with a 30-centimeter air gap between layers, creating an insulation barrier that also functions as a solar heat collector during winter and a heat exhaust during summer. The central mirrored cone that descends into the chamber below isn't purely decorative. It's a light reflector engineered to distribute daylight to the chamber's lower levels, while simultaneously serving as a thermal chimney that accelerates air circulation. The cone's geometry creates vortex patterns in the air flowing around it, patterns that architectural engineers recognize as optimized for maximum ventilation efficiency with minimum energy input. Foster's team didn't invent these principles. They rediscovered them, matching specifications that Wallet's engineers had already calculated 110 years earlier using slide rules and empirical testing. Both domes solve the same problem using the same geometric solution despite completely different construction technologies. What problem requires such specific architectural resolution? The Reichstag's energy profile provides clues. After Foster's renovation, the building consumes 94% less energy than comparable parliamentary structures worldwide, a reduction that energy analysts attribute to the dome's passive ventilation and natural lighting systems. But the energy savings exceed what passive design typically achieves. The building generates microclimates within its chambers that regulate temperature and air quality with precision that mechanical systems struggle to match, creating conditions that visitors describe as unusually comfortable regardless of external weather. The dome somehow moderates the building's internal environment through mechanisms that engineers can describe but not fully explain. Air pressure differentials that shouldn't develop from convection alone. Temperature stability that passive systems don't normally maintain. Light distribution that changes throughout the day in ways that seem to anticipate occupancy patterns. The building feels alive, responsive, as if the architecture itself were an environmental control system designed with knowledge of principles that modern engineering is only beginning to understand. The building's electromagnetic properties add another layer. Studies conducted during the renovation measured unusual electromagnetic field patterns in the chamber beneath the dome. Fluctuations that researchers initially attributed to electrical systems, but that persisted even when all power was shut off. The fields concentrate around the dome's central axis, creating a vertical column of measurable electromagnetic activity that extends from the foundation through the dome's apex. Geophysical surveys showed that this column aligns with a natural fault line in the bedrock below, a geological feature that creates earth current flows through the substrata. The Reichstag's foundation sits precisely positioned to intercept these currents, and the dome's iron and glass structure channels them upward in ways that appear deliberate. 19th century engineers wouldn't have had instruments to measure electromagnetic fields, Yet they positioned the building and designed its dome to interact with forces they theoretically shouldn't have known existed, unless the knowledge that went into the Reichstag's design came from sources that official architectural history doesn't acknowledge. The symbolic elements take on different meaning when viewed through this technical lens. The dedication inscription above the main entrance reads, Dem Deutschen Volke, to the German people. Added only in 1916 during World War I, 2 decades after the building opened. The original facade was blank, lacking the statement of purpose that most parliamentary buildings feature. Inside, the chamber's decoration includes allegorical sculptures representing German states and virtues, but also curious astronomical symbols that architectural historians interpret as neoclassical ornamentation, zodiac references, planetary positions, solar and lunar imagery integrated into ceiling mosaics and wall reliefs. The symbolism maps the heavens as they appeared in the late 19th century, creating what amounts to a celestial calendar frozen in architecture. Combined with the building's solar alignments and the dome's astronomical precision, the Reichstag begins to look less like a parliament and more like an observatory, or something that requires astronomical knowledge to operate properly. The question becomes, what was the Reichstag designed to do beyond housing parliamentary debate? The building's technical features suggest purposes that contemporary politics didn't require, and that modern restoration inexplicably preserved. The dome isn't architecture, it's apparatus. The foundation isn't structural support, it's connection to something beneath. The astronomical alignments aren't decoration, they're calibration. The electromagnetic properties aren't accidents, they're function. The building was engineered to interact with forces and phenomena that official 19th century science hadn't acknowledged, using knowledge that the official historical record suggests shouldn't have existed. Either German engineers in the 1880s possessed technological understanding far beyond what conventional history attributes to them, or they were working from plans and specifications that originated elsewhere, implementing designs they inherited rather than invented. Consider the broader context of 19th century Berlin. The city's transformation from provincial capital to imperial metropolis involved architectural projects of unusual ambition. The construction of massive public buildings with technical sophistication that seemed to exceed immediate necessity. Infrastructure systems that anticipated growth patterns decades in advance. And building designs that incorporated engineering principles allegedly not yet formalized. The Reichstag was part of this larger pattern, but unlike museums and palaces that could justify their grandeur through cultural prestige, parliament buildings were supposed to be functional and pragmatic. The Reichstag's technical excess demands explanation beyond imperial ambition. The building was engineered to do something specific, something that required the dome's exact positioning, the foundation's depth, the chamber's geometry, and the structure's electromagnetic properties. Parliamentary debate doesn't require any of these features. The dome's 2 constructions reveal consistent purpose across technological eras. Wallett's iron and glass dome of 1894 and Foster's modern glass dome of 1999 achieve identical functional outcomes. Precise air circulation, specific light distribution, electromagnetic channeling, astronomical alignment, and environmental regulation. Both domes respond to the same architectural requirements despite utilizing completely different materials and construction methods. The consistency suggests that the dome's specifications weren't aesthetic choices, but technical necessities, and that both architects were working to meet parameters that the building itself demanded, rather than parameters they invented. The Reichstag required its dome then, and requires it now, not because of style or symbolism, but because without the dome, the building cannot perform its actual function, whatever that function is. The historical narrative offered to explain the dome begins to fragment under scrutiny. We're told that Wallet designed the dome for grandeur and ventilation, that it burned in 1933 due to arson, that it was removed to simplify reconstruction, and that Foster added a new dome for democratic symbolism and sustainability. Each explanation addresses surface questions while avoiding deeper technical realities. The dome's original engineering exceeded ventilation requirements. The fire's damage patterns suggest intentional destruction. The removal eliminated functional capacity rather than simplifying reconstruction. The restoration mandate prioritized dome reconstruction over all other design elements. What emerges is a pattern of carefully constructed explanations that satisfy casual inquiry while obscuring underlying purpose. The Reichstag's official history reads like cover story, a narrative designed to explain visible facts without revealing functional truth. The building stands now as working parliament and tourist destination, its glass dome admitting 50,000 visitors monthly who spiral upward through Foster's transparent architecture. Looking down into the plenary hall, where contemporary German democracy conducts its debates. The symbolism is obvious and intentional. Transparency, openness, citizens above their representatives. But beneath that political metaphor runs the same technical apparatus that Wallet installed in 1894, now updated with modern materials but operating on identical principles. The visitors walking through the dome are moving through a structure whose actual purpose has nothing to do with democracy or symbolism and everything to do with functions that architectural history doesn't discuss and that official explanations carefully avoid. The Reichstag's dome channels forces that contemporary science barely acknowledges, using knowledge that official history claims shouldn't exist, performing functions that parliamentary buildings theoretically don't require. The implications extend beyond one building. If the Reichstag's design incorporates knowledge that 19th century engineers theoretically shouldn't possess, where did that knowledge originate? The official answer would point to architectural genius and engineering innovation, the gradual accumulation of technical understanding that explains all historical progress. But the Reichstag specifications don't represent gradual innovation. They represent sudden application of complete knowledge, as if the designers were implementing existing plans rather than developing new concepts. The astronomical alignments, the electromagnetic channeling, the geometric precision, the foundation depth all suggest a level of integrated technical understanding that official 19th century science hadn't achieved. Either we're missing major developments in 19th century engineering that somehow left no other trace in the historical record, or the engineers building the Reichstag had access to knowledge from sources that official history doesn't acknowledge. Neither explanation fits conventional historical narratives, which means conventional historical narratives are incomplete. The building's survival through 2 world wars and Cold War division suggests protection that transcends politics. The Reichstag was bombed, burned, gutted, and abandoned. Yet the core structure remained intact. And when restoration came, the mandate was reconstruction rather than replacement. Buildings with far less damage were demolished and rebuilt throughout Berlin. But the Reichstag was preserved, its foundation and essential structure maintained even when the dome was removed and the interior destroyed. Something about the building's fundamental architecture was too important to lose. Important enough that successive governments across drastically different political systems all chose preservation over replacement. The Reichstag wasn't just a symbol of German democracy. It was infrastructure of a different kind. Something that performed functions valuable enough to protect regardless of political ideology. What functions could transcend the ideological divide between Nazi Germany, Soviet occupation, and modern democratic reunification? The answer lies not in politics, but in the architecture itself, in the technical features that persist across reconstructions, in the requirements that force even modern architects to recreate 19th century specifications, in the dome that must be positioned exactly where it was positioned before, because the building's geometry demands it. The Reichstag is a machine disguised as monument, a technological apparatus hidden within political architecture, a structure designed to interact with forces and phenomena that official science hasn't fully integrated into mainstream understanding. The dome isn't added centuries after original design because of aesthetic preference or symbolic value. The dome is mandatory because without it, the machine doesn't function. And the machine's function is significant enough that its reconstruction became non-negotiable priority once German reunification made restoration possible. Whatever the Reichstag does beyond housing Parliament, it's been doing it since 1894, and it's doing it again now, beneath glass instead of iron, but with identical technical specifications and identical functional outcomes. Official history presents the Berlin Reichstag as political architecture with interesting technical features. The building's technical specifications, its geometric precision, its electromagnetic properties, its astronomical alignments, and its consistent functional requirements across reconstructions present something else entirely. Evidence of technological knowledge implemented in the 19th century that contemporary science is only beginning to understand. Architecture that serves purposes beyond the political functions it was publicly designed to house. And knowledge transmission that official historical narratives don't explain because acknowledging it would require rewriting fundamental assumptions about technological development and historical progress. The dome was necessary then, remains necessary now, and will be necessary in any future reconstruction. Not because of what it symbolizes, but because of what it does. The question isn't why the dome was added centuries after original design. The question is what the dome does that makes its precise reconstruction mandatory, and what that tells us about knowledge that official history claims didn't exist when the Reichstag was first conceived. The building stands as testament to engineering that transcends its era, knowledge that predates its application, and purposes that architecture was designed to conceal rather than reveal. The Berlin Reichstag's dome stands as architectural proof that official historical narratives conceal more than they reveal. Every technical specification, every geometric precision, every electromagnetic anomaly points toward knowledge that shouldn't exist in the timeline we're taught. The building's requirements transcend political function and enter territory that contemporary science barely acknowledges. Structures designed to interact with planetary forces, architecture calibrated to celestial mechanics, foundations connected to geological currents that flow beneath official awareness. The dome wasn't added for aesthetics or removed for convenience. It's essential apparatus, mandatory infrastructure that both 19th century engineers and modern architects understood must be positioned exactly where it stands, functioning exactly as it functions, regardless of the explanations offered to satisfy public curiosity. What we call the Reichstag is merely the visible surface of something larger, something that required precise construction in 1894 and required precise reconstruction in 1999, because the underlying purpose never changed. The parliamentary debates, the democratic symbolism, the tourist visits, all occur atop infrastructure serving functions that have nothing to do with governance and everything to do with capabilities that official technology claims don't exist. The building breathes, channels, aligns, and regulates in ways that passive architecture shouldn't achieve, maintaining environmental conditions and electromagnetic patterns that engineers can measure but cannot fully explain through conventional principles. The consistency across reconstruction eras isn't coincidence. It's evidence of specifications that cannot be altered because the system they serve demands exact parameters. The broader implications extend far beyond Berlin. If one parliamentary building contains hidden technological sophistication that predates official scientific understanding, how many other 19th century structures were built with similar specifications? The explosion of monumental architecture across European capitals during that era. Parliament buildings, museums, observatories, railway stations, all sharing similar engineering excess, similar foundation depths, similar astronomical alignments, and similar geometric precision. What appears as individual architectural achievement may actually be coordinated implementation of inherited knowledge, a civilization-wide construction program disguised as national prestige projects. The Reichstag isn't an anomaly. It's an example, one building among many that reveals its true nature only when examined beyond the historical explanations designed to satisfy surface inquiry. The knowledge required to design the Reichstag came from somewhere, and that somewhere isn't the official progression of 19th century engineering science. The astronomical calibration, the electromagnetic channeling, the geometric sophistication, the environmental regulation systems all suggest access to completed knowledge rather than developmental innovation. Civilizations don't suddenly engineer buildings to interact with forces they haven't yet discovered unless they're working from plans that encode understanding from previous eras or previous sources. The Reichstag's design suggests knowledge transfer across temporal or cultural boundaries that official history doesn't acknowledge. Implementation of technical specifications that architects inherited rather than invented. Construction of infrastructure serving purposes that political narratives were designed to obscure. Stand beneath Foster's glass dome on a clear night when the plenary hall below is empty and the city lights dim, and you can feel what the architecture actually does. The air moves in patterns that seem independent of wind. The temperature stabilizes in ways that passive design doesn't achieve. And the space itself feels charged with presence that has nothing to do with political history. The building is active, functional, operational in ways that parliamentary architecture theoretically shouldn't be. Whatever the Reichstag was built to do, it's still doing it. Hidden beneath layers of official explanation and democratic symbolism, performing functions that successive governments have protected and preserved because those functions matter more than the political ideologies that temporarily govern the chambers below. The dome reveals the truth to anyone willing to look beyond the historical narrative. We're surrounded by infrastructure from knowledge systems we don't fully understand, living among architectural achievements that official timelines cannot adequately explain. And the buildings we think we know are actually doing things we've never been told. The air moves in patterns that seem independent of wind. The temperature stabilizes in ways that passive design doesn't achieve. And the space itself feels charged with presence that has nothing to do with political history. The building is active, functional, operational in ways that parliamentary architecture theoretically shouldn't be. Whatever the Reichstag was built to do, it's still doing it. Hidden beneath layers of official explanation and democratic symbolism, performing functions that successive governments have protected and preserved because those functions matter more than the political ideologies that temporarily govern the chambers below. The dome reveals the truth to anyone willing to look beyond the historical narrative. We're surrounded by infrastructure from knowledge systems we don't fully understand, living among architectural achievements that official timelines cannot adequately explain. And the buildings we think we know are actually doing things we've never been told. This is the reality that the Berlin Reichstag's dome exposes. Official history is incomplete at best, deliberately misleading at worst. And the architecture standing around us contains evidence of technological sophistication and knowledge transmission that current narratives cannot accommodate without fundamental revision. The dome was necessary then, remains necessary now, and the precision of its reconstruction after decades of absence proves that someone, somewhere, understands exactly what it does and why it cannot be eliminated or relocated or fundamentally altered. The question isn't why architectural elements were added centuries later. The question is what those elements do, who really designed them, and what their continued operation tells us about the civilization. We think we know, but actually inherit from sources that official history has worked very hard to keep hidden. The Reichstag stands as testimony that the past we're taught and the past that actually occurred are not the same thing. And the difference matters more than comfortable historical narratives want us to believe.